February 5th, 1941, the Via Balbia, 60 miles south of Benghazi. Lieutenant Colonel John Combe was about to play the most dangerous hand of poker in the history of the Second World War. His cards were terrible. Barely 2,000 exhausted soldiers and a few battered light tanks. His opponent's hand, the entire Italian 10th Army. 100,000 men rolling down the highway directly towards him, desperate to escape to Tripoli. If Combes' men fired their weapons, the Italians would instantly realise they outnumbered the British 50-1. They could crush Combes' tiny force in an hour. But Combe knew something the Italians didn't. He knew that an army running for its life is already half defeated in its mind. He just had to convince 100,000 men that they were trapped. So, he blocked the road. Welcome to Britain's history, where 2,000 British soldiers trapped and destroyed an army 50 times their size, and where a cook, a batman, and a major stopped the last Italian tank attack with a single gun. But before we get to that road and that bluff, we need to understand how the Italian 10th Army ended up retreating through the desert at all, and what General Richard O'Connor had seen that made him risk everything on a single flying column. Operation Compass began on December 9th, 1940, as a 5-day raid. The Western Desert Force under O'Connor, 36,000 men against 250,000 Italians, had torn through the Italian positions at Sidi Barrani, with a shock attack that the Italians were never able to recover from. What was planned as a limited operation became something else entirely. The Italians broke so completely that O'Connor kept going. The Italian army in North Africa was enormous on paper. 250,000 men, 400 guns, 300 tanks. What it was not was well led, well supplied, or well equipped for the kind of war it found itself fighting. The Italian High Command had pushed Marshal Graziani into invading Egypt before his forces were ready, before his supply lines could support a sustained offensive, before his commanders had any real plan beyond marching to a map reference and stopping. When the British hit back, withdrawal to the next position became a habit that the Italian commanders could not break. The Italian soldier was not the problem. Many of them fought with considerable courage, as Beda Fomm itself would show. The problem was a command structure that had lost confidence in itself and a technical disadvantage that proved fatal in fluid desert fighting. The Italian M13/40 tanks were not badly armed. Their 47 mm guns could handle British cruiser tanks, but they had no radios. In a desert battle where coordination was everything, Italian tank commanders communicated by flag signal and hand gesture, which meant every attack fragmented the moment contact was made and the dust closed in. Bardia fell. Tobruk fell. The Italian 10th Army, what remained of it after each successive disaster, was retreating west along the coast road through Kyrenaica, trying to reach the safety of Tripolitania before the British caught up. O'Connor looked at his map and saw something. The Italian army was moving along the Via Balbia, the coastal road that curved north and then west through Benghazi before turning south again. His armoured forces following in pursuit were travelling the long way round, but there was another route. Across the desert, cutting directly south of the Jebel Akhdar mountains, a straight line that would arrive on the coast road ahead of the retreating Italians if the timing worked. It was rough country, unmapped in parts, 250 miles of rock, wadi and soft sand that had never been crossed by a formation of this size. His vehicles were already badly worn after weeks of fighting and movement. The column would be operating beyond any possibility of resupply or reinforcement. O'Connor decided to try it. He assembled the fastest elements of the 7th Armoured Division into a single column and gave it to Combe. The Rifle Brigade provided the infantry, motorised, experienced, exactly the right soldiers for this kind of operation. The 4th Royal Horse Artillery brought their 25-pounders. The 106th RHA added anti-tank guns mounted on trucks, able to move and shoot at speed. The 11th Hussars and King's Dragoon Guards provided the armoured cars that would screen and probe and find the way. They set off on February 4th. What followed was 30 hours of driving that tested every man and every vehicle to their limits. The terrain was worse than expected. Sharp rocks shredded tyres, hidden gullies sent vehicles lurching and crashing. The soft sand swallowed wheels and tracks with indifference. Water rations were cut to a single cup per man per day. Sleep was measured in minutes. Vehicles that broke down were cannibalized for parts on the spot and left behind. The men of the 11th Hussars had been in the desert since before the war. They knew this landscape in the way that sailors know a sea, not by chart, but by instinct, by the colour of the sand and the way the light fell at dusk. They found paths through terrain that looked impassable and kept the column moving when it should have stopped. Without them, the whole operation would have stalled in the first 12 hours. When the weather closed in on the second night, officers climbed onto the roofs of their vehicles in freezing rain and wind to read their compasses, trying to hold a course through darkness across ground that looked identical in every direction. The column spread and compressed as vehicles lost sight of each other, drivers pressing forward on faith that the man ahead of them knew where he was going. They reached the coast road on the afternoon of February 5th with 30 minutes to spare. 30 minutes. The leading elements of the Italian convoy appeared on the horizon, while Combe's men were still laying mines across the tarmac and finding firing positions in the scrub on either side. If the column had been slower, or the Italians faster, or the desert slightly less cooperative, the 10th Army would have passed through an empty junction and escaped to Tripoli. The entire campaign would have ended differently. Instead, the first Italian vehicle hit a mine. The convoy stopped, and from the scrub on both sides of the road, the firing began. The Italian commanders didn't know what they were facing. A patrol? A small blocking force? They sent vehicles forward to probe. The probes were destroyed. They brought up more. The convoy stretched back northward for miles, and the pressure from the Australians pursuing from the north was building. The Italians had to break through. The 2nd Battalion Rifle Brigade had dug in across and around the road with the thoroughness of soldiers who understood that their position was their only asset. There were no reinforcements coming. There was nowhere to fall back to. The road had to hold, or the entire operation had failed. They laid their anti-tank guns in carefully chosen positions in the scrub, sighted to catch attacking armour in enfilade, shooting along the length of the target rather than at its front armour. And they waited. What Combe had that the Italians didn't know about was a low rise in the ground about 7 miles north of the main blocking position. The British called it the Pimple. It was nothing, a slight undulation, in otherwise flat desert. But it meant that British tanks could shelter behind it, with only their turrets exposed, taking shots at the Italian armour while presenting the smallest possible target. The 2nd Royal Tank Regiment used it to systematically pick apart every Italian thrust before it could build momentum. The Italian tanks, mostly M13/40S, reasonably armed but mechanically unreliable and critically short of radios, attacked in fragments. Without radio communication, the Italian commanders couldn't coordinate. Each group that came forward came alone, not knowing where its neighbours were, not able to call for support. The British anti-tank gunners and the cruiser tanks on the Pimple destroyed them one by one. The attacks continued through February 6th, increasingly desperate. The Italian convoy behind was being bombed by the RAF. Fuel was running out. Water was almost gone. From the north, the Australians were closing in on Benghazi. General Tellerer, commanding what remained of the 10th Army, made the decision that said everything about the man. He could have sat in his headquarters and issued orders. Instead, he climbed into a tank himself, gathered the last available M13/40 IAS, and led the final breakout attempt personally. His tank was hit. He was torn apart by shrapnel. He survived long enough to be carried back and die in a field hospital the following day. The Italians buried him with full military honours. Even Tellerer's charge was contained. But the battle was not quite over. On the morning of February 7th, the last significant Italian tank attack broke through the outer British positions and reached almost to the gun line itself. The anti-tank battery had taken casualties. One gun had its crew wiped out. A major named Burton found himself with a single working weapon and no trained artilleryman to crew it. He took his batman. He took the battery cook. Neither man had any formal training on the gun. Burton laid it himself and the three of them worked it together, loading and firing as the Italian tanks came on. The last of the M13/40S reached to within 18 metres of the officer's mess tent before Burton's improvised crew stopped it. 5 tanks destroyed, by a cook, a batman, and a major who refused to walk away from a gun. After that, there was nothing left to fight with. The Italian officers came forward under white flags. General Bergonzoli, the commander who had been escaping from the British since Bardia, the man his own troops called Electric Whiskers for his extraordinary pointed beard, came in with his staff. He had escaped from Bardia when it fell, escaped from Tobruk when it fell, and had been somewhere in the retreating column for the entire 2 days of the battle. There was nowhere left to escape to. The surrender was complete. The 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats as they were already being called, had been fighting continuously since the previous December. Their vehicles were held together by improvisation and stubbornness. Tanks that should have been in workshops were still running because their crews refused to let them stop. The men who climbed out of those vehicles after the last white flag went up had the look that soldiers get after sustained action. Not triumph exactly, more a kind of quiet exhaustion that knows the thing is done. O'Connor sent a signal to headquarters in Cairo. The operation had begun as a 5-day raid and had lasted 2 months. It had destroyed an army of 250,000 men. It had taken 2,000 miles of North African territory. Against those 250,000, British and Dominion casualties were under 2,000 killed and wounded. He kept the message short. On the suggestion of his Chief of Staff Dorman Smith, and sent deliberately unencoded so that the Italians could read it, the telegram borrowed from the traditional language of the English fox hunt. Fox killed in the open. The fox had been killed in the open. In 2 months, against odds that on paper were impossible, a force that never exceeded 40,000 men had destroyed the largest Italian army in North Africa and taken 130,000 prisoners. It was one of the most complete victories in British military history, achieved at a cost that would have seemed derisory if you had described it in advance. O'Connor wanted to continue. His vehicles were worn down to almost nothing, but Tripoli was 400 miles to the west, with almost no Italian forces between him and it. He believed, and subsequent events suggested he was right, that a final push would have ended the North African campaign then and there. Churchill stopped him. Greece was being threatened by German forces moving through the Balkans. The forces that had just destroyed the 10th Army were redirected to a different theatre. The 6th Australian Division shipped out. The armoured units, their vehicles barely functional, were pulled back for refit. The drive on Tripoli was cancelled. 3 weeks later, Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripolitania with the Africa Corps. The decision to stop at El Agheila is one of the most debated of the entire North African campaign. Whether Churchill was right to prioritise Greece over Tripoli, whether the exhausted British armour could have made it without breaking down completely, whether Rommel would have arrived in time to change the outcome, these questions still occupy historians. What is certain is that the opportunity O'Connor had created was not exploited, and the war in North Africa would go on for another 2 years of brutal back and forth across the same desert that Combe's column had crossed in 30 hours of rain and darkness. By April 1941, the British were back at the Egyptian frontier. Tobruk was besieged. The ground that had been taken at such cost was almost entirely lost again. Rommel proved to be a different kind of opponent. He understood the same principles O'Connor had used: speed, initiative, the sudden thrust at the unexpected point, and he applied them with German resources behind him, rather than the worn-down remnants of a force that had been fighting continuously for 2 months. O'Connor himself did not see any of it. In March 1941, he and General Neame took a wrong turn in the desert at night and drove into a German patrol. The general who had conceived and executed the most brilliant British desert operation of the war spent the next 2 years as a prisoner in Italy, watching from captivity as Rommel fought back and forth across the territory O'Connor had taken in a matter of weeks. He escaped in the chaos of Italy's armistice in 1943, made his way back to Allied lines, and went on to command a corps in Normandy. He received a knighthood. He died in 1981, at 91, the last of the great commanders of the Western Desert. The cook and the batman who helped Major Burton stop the last Italian tank attack are not recorded by name anywhere in the regimental histories. They did what they did because there was nobody else available, at a moment when the alternative was to step back and let it fail. That, in a sense, is the whole story of Beda Fomm. Not one act of heroism, but thousands of small decisions made by men who were cold and hungry and exhausted and very far from any kind of support, who kept the road blocked because the one thing they absolutely could not do was let it go. What happened at Beda Fomm was a demonstration of a principle that military academies still teach, that speed and initiative, applied at the right moment against the right vulnerability, can produce results entirely disproportionate to the forces involved. 2,000 men blocked a road and held it for 2 days against everything 100,000 could throw at them. They held it not because they were stronger, but because they were there first, and because every man from Combe to the cook understood that the one thing they absolutely could not do was move. That is what happened at Beda Fomm.